Without any further ado, I'd like now to move to our keynote address. But I was sitting there and just wondering, I felt so cold. Don't you feel cold this side? Is there a way that perhaps we can close this door here, or maybe just a little bit? It's very, very cold that side. Remember, my job is to make sure that you're all comfortable, all right? And I'm going to charge you for that, Mr. Keynote Address Speaker. Also, the colleagues, I had asked that they remove the chairs that were here. Can I just ask that I should have asked them to retain one, because I need the one so that I can sit and threaten the speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, we are now ready for our keynote address. It is going to be done by none other than Mr. Brian Kagoro. He is the Managing Director of Programs at the Open Society Foundations, South Africa. Brian is a global justice activist, a constitutional and economic relations lawyer, social entrepreneur, and a writer on Pan-Africanism. He's, as I said, works for Open Society Foundation. He brings extensive experience in public sector reforms, conflict transformation, transitional, restorative, and reparative justice. His expertise lies in transformative governance, socio-economic justice, global alliance building, and multilateral systems reform. And he really does not need any introduction. I was with him last week at 2 events where he spoke powerfully, and in one way, in the same panel together, and he even used a biblical story. I thought that was great. Let's give him a round of applause, please.
Good morning. Aheng. Goeiemorgen. Sanbonan. Habari zenu. Bonjour. Well, to the organizers, I saw Prof. You see there in the corner there. At least you know that I duly honor you. And Prof, thank you so much for those remarks. And to the eminent persons, I see folks who taught me in kindergarten in the room. So at least if this is a terrible keynote, blame them. If it is good, I think give credit to Jagan. Yesterday, he sent me a note. He said, "What are you going to say?" I said, He said, "I've sent you what to say, so." Let me start with an anecdote. There were very important men who were not in Johannesburg this last week. And their reasons for absence, in essence, captures dynamics within the emerging and complex multilateral system, the tensions between the old and the new, and in a Gramscian sense, the old that is reluctant to die, the new that is struggling to come into life, and in between are morbid symptoms. Vladimir Putin was not in Johannesburg. Those who speculate suggest that Vladimir was not here because there is a court warrant. And South Africa, being a member of the Rome Statute, there was a sense that Vladimir did not want the embarrassment, nor did the South African government want a repeat of Bashir. Whatever the reasons, Vladimir was not here. President Xi Jinping of China was not here. and Donald Trump of America was not here. In essence, if you are looking at global equities, 80% of global equities value was not in Johannesburg. If you are looking at global innovation, at least 68% was not in Johannesburg. And yet, Johannesburg managed to profoundly achieve. Of course, President Xi Jinping sent Premier Li Qiang here, and Vladimir Putin was represented and remained very supportive of his brother comrades in South Africa. The one who was not here, having tried to cast aspersions on both the country, the people, and the agenda, is a very interesting one, because the agenda, the presidency of South Africa, was framed around strengthening disaster resilience and response, ensuring debt sustainability for low-income countries, mobilizing finance for a just energy transition, harnessing critical minerals for inclusive growth and sustainable development. If you look at global statistics, I thought to share these because you are scholars. It seems rather perfunctory, it seems rather decadent, and a waste of time to repeat to you statistics that you normally use. So we are told Africa's SDG financing gap is 1.3 trillion annually. We are also told that the infrastructure gap is between 181 and 221 billion per year. That the private sector share is only 10% of infrastructure financing. And African governments, for example, fund 90% of infrastructure. In essence, that African governments, with all the dysfunctions that we ascribe to them, fund 90% of infrastructure. In simple terms, they subsidize both the domestic and foreign private sector that operates in Africa, touting great efficiency. They are subsidized in terms of electricity. They are subsidized in terms of utilization of roads. They are subsidized by who? The African taxpayer. We are also told that the tax to GDP ratio in Africa hovers around an average of 16%, way below a global average of 34%. And that FDI inflows into Africa are 97 billion. We're 97 billion in 2024, and just 6% of global FDI. Friends, why am I regurgitating statistics that you know? It's because for me to say what Jagan wanted me to say, I need to situate the site of the G20 summit, the hosts of the G20 summit, which, by the way, were South Africa and the African Union, within a very complex global context where the average growth rate in South Africa remains at below 4%, unemployment very high, this country carries with it the ghost of apartheid, the ghost of structural adjustment programs in its region, the ghost of the neo-colonial moment and heightened neoliberal consciousness that suggested that we privatize everything, that also suggested that we collateralize everything, that suggested to us that if we opened up our economies indiscriminately and allowed FDI, somehow there'll be a trickle down of development to our peoples. Thabo Mbeki's high-level panel then informed us that despite the commitment to corruption amongst our political elite, that corruption only accounts for 5% of what the continent loses by way of financial outflows. And money laundering was slightly more, but still less than 15%. That the bulk of the bleeding of this continent happens through some transactions not really illegal. That's why they were called illicit. These transactions bleed the continent, depending on who's calculating, an amount of between $90 to $150 billion per annum. How? Through deals structured, written, and through the existence of tax havens in the developed world. And here is the interesting thing. For Africa to develop the infrastructure that I said subsidizes the private sector, and most of the private sector really in a lot of the small African countries are external entities that have domiciled themselves in the domestic market. We will go to bilaterals and multilaterals to borrow money. And we borrow that money at a premium. An African country borrowing pays almost 3-4 times more interest than a European country or a Latin American or Asian country, by virtue of one simple reason, that the assessed risk of the African country is much higher. And yet, if you look at the data, Africa's repayment rates or default on infrastructure loan repayments is much lower than anybody else. So there is a coloniality of power and perception and practice in how this continent and parts of the global south are treated within the global financial architecture, which was designed, as Prof. you rightly said, designed under the moment when Africa was deemed a site of extraction. Extraction of raw materials, raw minerals, and also a site, a net market or importer of finished products. This was anchored on 3 beliefs. The first belief was that the continent lacked complexity and sophistication, and that amongst the Africans there did not reposit or exist sufficient skills, and that it would be too expensive and non-profitable to develop within the African university and technicons, the technical capacities that would enable Africa to achieve. Many of you academics like to refer to South Korea and co, and I keep repeating to people that please don't say how come Africa didn't do what South Korea did. South Korea is the largest recipient.
Please keep going. Please keep going. I'm just saying.
No. I'm suspicious. I think that I must have offended someone. They now need wallpaper.
My apologies. No, they wanted to change the Wi-Fi thing.
Okay. So the speech will start after this.
My apologies.
What's your name?
Arthur. There we go. Sorry about that.
Okay, so Arthur, you are safe, huh? Okay, forget everything else I said. So the long and short of my submission is that we're trying to address a number of power asymmetries okay? And those power asymmetries relate to technology, to economic development and underdevelopment. And I had, in trying to narrate the component of the cost of capital, tried to bring you to a moment where there is a realization that Africa was locked in to a system that would, according to Walter Rodney, not just how Europe underdeveloped Africa, but according to me, how the structure of the global financial architecture, the multilateral system, the structuring of global trade rules and tax rules, and the structure of global debt systems was such that Africa would perennially, even if it became very ethical, would perennially be locked in a cycle of underdevelopment. And that African countries would be engaged in a false beauty pageantry of seeing who could target inflation and reduce it to single digits, who could reduce corruption and improve the ease of doing business. Professors, you know that the highest FDI inflows onto the continent are not to the country with the best ease of doing business index. And yet you still teach that the problem is that Africa has not improved its ease of doing business. Either there is something wrong with you professors, or there is something wrong with the books you are reading. The FDI inflows into Nigeria, into Ethiopia, into Egypt are not related at all to the assessment of whether or not it is easy to do business in those countries. They are driven purely and largely by the interests of those that are investing. And as you have dialogue over the next few days, I need you to understand that the point I was making before Arthur came to the stage was that Africa was told during the structural adjustment moment that it was cheaper to train the expertise that Africa needed from the medical field to engineering and elsewhere in Europe than to invest in shoring up the capacity of African institutions. And so a pilgrimage began where constantly, without creating transition gaps, we sent all our children to Europe and to the Americas or to North America to go and learn. This is notwithstanding that if we were watching the Global Innovation Index, the countries to which we are sending our students to, or that we are paying premium dollar as private parents or as states, are not the countries that are defining the new moment of global innovation, or at least designing the technologies that we need to transition from poverty to where we need to go. So within the context of the G20, the conversation needed to focus not on an abstract discussion of AI, not on an abstract discussion of critical minerals, not on an abstract discussion of debt, but a discussion that says, how do we break the system that is designed to lock us in? There were several imperatives. The one was to end the end of exceptionalism. Being hosted by South Africa makes me a little uncomfortable to say this truth. But since I was born incapable of observing any protocols, allow me to say that for a moment, the residual colonial settler states, South Africa, Zimbabwe, Namibia, and Kenya, thought they were exceptional. So for a very long time, they would try and have a deal with the Europeans because they thought by just the volume and intensity of European descendants in their countries that they were distinct from the rest of the continent. And this moment of vilification of those countries and difficulties of dealing only with the external world and not with the continent has created an aha moment or a Damascene moment of the end of exceptionalism. At this G20, I stood with pride as I listened to every South African minister say, we are Pan-Africanist, that this is about the continent as a collective, and sounding as though they were way beyond the rhetoric of simply saying we're part of the continent, but actually believed that with the cut that they're seeing from the US and with the challenges they are facing, South Africa has to realize what MTN and South Africa's 5 major companies realized. MTN and those 5 major South African companies make more than 60% of their annual income from outside of South Africa. They make it in the rest of the continent. So this end of exceptionalism is very important to me as a Pan-Africanist, because it essentially means we're negotiating a new pact of what it means to be South Africa in Africa and South Africa as Africa. Number 2, we're in an age of transactional bilateralism where folks can be taken to the Oval Office and told, give us your critical minerals at this rate, or this will happen, right? Or a genocide of sorts is constructed using fake news, and then you are supposed to kowtow, or you are supposed to adjust your entire life to it. Seeing South Africa stand up to bullying essentially means that beyond the Sahel AES states who used an approach where military rule began to articulate a vision of a decolonization of economic relations between Africa and her former colonizers, South Africa offered in the G20 a voice of a country deemed and considered democratic, beginning to say, no, the structuring of these relations based on these old paradigms will not work, cannot work for the interests of our people. We are not rule takers, we also are rule givers. And for it to come from a democratic country, without the rancor that Prof. you talked about, essentially means there is a redefinition of what collective African diplomacy or African international relations could and should or might look like. It'll take much more than a moment of the G20. It'll take a movement of African countries that have the courage inclusive multilateralism in this context of transactional bilateralism and unilateralism, of course, didn't just come about because we have values of Ubuntu. It came about because we messed up in Libya. It came about because we've made fundamental mistakes. So the moment we are in allows us to say, Africa, if Africa wants inclusive multilateralism, Africa will have to lead the design of that and not expect it to come from elsewhere. And Africa often forgets, with a demographic of largely young people with a median age of 19, in a world where fertility rates are plummeting in the developed world, whether that developed world is in the West or the East, that Africa is being perceived in 3 ways, and please, professors, study and write about it. Number 1, black and brown babies, which means African and Indian babies and others, are being seen as a threat. If you read websites from the right, they're talking about racial dilution and forms of dilution. And some of you dismiss it as pure rancor. It's not. It's a genuine fear. And if you're going to deal with people and understand why they behave irrationally, at least understand their fear. If you publish in the New York Times that 1 in every 4 in every whatever are going to be African, you are not consorting us that we will retain our dominance and historical privilege. You are suggesting that beware the African and its unrestrained capacity to produce children. Which children will either migrate to where you are or become a little bit more nationalistic and patriotic. And if they wake up early enough, become united and start asserting themselves. And this will be the end of empire, or a rewelding, or a remaking. Number 2, they are being viewed as labor, caregivers. You see, the idea of hewers of wood, carriers of water, has not exited certain people's minds. that all that we would be good for is make sure that when Germany now has or Europe now has a 300,000 labor deficit, it can look to Africa for cheap labor. When the Middle East needs people to become domestic workers, it can look to Africa. Africa still has not built a conception of valuing its labor, skilled, semi-skilled, and non-skilled. And add to that a layer of care work of women who are invisibilized, who bail out the state, because every day they take care of the excesses of misdirected economic policy and underdevelopment. I want to suggest to you colleagues that inclusive multilateralism requires an African Union that does not spend its time fighting over Francophone, Anglophone, Lusophone, Arabophone, and any other phony. But that pays. In the context of this, friends, is the rise of middle powers. They have complex interests and relationships. They are not an enemy. It's not an ideological base. We're not exactly where we were in Bandung, because yes, there is a Bandungish spirit, but the middle powers are dealers. They want to deal with us. They want to deal with China. They want to deal with America. They want to deal. And the rise of middle powers, Africans are still, we're still in a romantic moment where the binaries of left and right, progressive, non-progressive, could be neatly cut. Unfortunately, Prof, those binaries are more complex now. So as we relate to China or Russia, please let's remember, this is not the Soviet communist republics. This is Russia, right? Russia's ideology is not the same ideology as the South African Communist Party. It's a country pursuing its interests, projecting its power. Yes, there's a historical affinity, but as they say, those of us who grew up in large families, I can tell from your face, sir, that your family was not the average English-sized family. If you grew up in a large family, you had to share food. Sometimes I'll put it in the same plate. And if it was families where you expected to pray, you learned to pray with one eye open, because if you close both eyes, by the time you woke up, there'll be very little relish left in the field, right? So there is wisdom here. Whether it's Russia, it's China, it's Turkey, it's whoever you're dealing with. I'm essentially saying when this conference is analyzing the G20, let's not talk about the global south purely in terms that are African agency in this multipolar world essentially assumes that Africa has to have some collective approach. I want to use a term that a colleague suggested to me. In these days of democratic, social, and other relationships, right, monogamy is often till death do us apart, right? So I want to suggest to you that Africa must take a polyamorous approach to its relationships with the rest of the world. Polyamory, you can Google, I was going to tell you what it means in Zulu. It means in J, it's an open relationship, yeah? Right? That basically polyamory means you can have multiple partners, right? Now, Africa is being pursued by Saudi Arabia, by UAE, by Turkey, by, South Korea. Everybody wants a piece of Africa. And Africa has a pretty boy syndrome. It is just stuck and everyone wants us. We have 30% of what they need, or 60, or 70, whatever, we are wanted. But Africa needs to determine its own value. The West, the USA, Europe, G7, China, the BRICS. In those contexts, Africa needs to define her collective interests. But Africa needs to project a collective power. Let me be very frank. South Africa's economy in comparison to India, which overshoot the UK as the 5th largest economy in the world, would be small. never mind Zimbabwe, Burundi, and etc. I want to suggest to you, colleagues, that leveraging these competing interests and remaining non-aligned or strategically aligned based on interest or process or sector requires academics, requires researchers, requires members of parliament and politicians to go beyond the big deal alcoholism. Can I repeat that? In our countries, presidents and parliamentarians now want to be judged on the basis of the big deals that they have clinched. And often those big deals have a short-termism to them. The second point I wanted to make beyond polyamory is that strategic developmental regionalism and Pan-Africanism are no longer an option. You know, many years we used to say, what is Pan-African? Where is it? Can someone define it? Well, whether you know how to define it or you don't. If you don't organize, come together, leverage what the AFCFTA, the African Continental Trade Agreement, the African Mining Vision, and etc., you are going to be picked apart one by one. Your judiciaries, your parliaments, your politicians, your streets are not big enough to deal with monopolies and oligopolies. The oligarchs will now run the world. Power has been redefined to include, yes, the powerful states, but oligarchs who now influence agrarian policy, agricultural policy, they influence technology policy, and etc. So Africa needs to decide how it will leverage strategic developmental regionalism driven by Pan-Africanism, undergirded by these values or principles of Ubuntu, to ensure that Agenda 2063 plus AU Mining Vision and AFCFTA, which, by the way, professors, they were designed before these last 4 years. So they may need rapid updates to deal with the realities of the current world. I grew up in a moment where we were being taught ideology is dead. What we need is pragmatism. And now ideology has come back. The Africa is pragmatic. The West and the East are ideologically anchored and driven by 50 and 100-year visions of what they want to achieve. Now, we obviously can play and are playing in norm entrepreneurship or agenda setting. Africa spoke with one voice in agenda setting for the global tax reform. Africa spoke with one voice at the G20 on global debt governance, on IFI reforms. Africa spoke with one voice on the question of solidarity. South Africa, in fact, galvanized the world on the Gaza question. On South-South, the strategy that Africa has for dealing with Latin America, with the Caribbean, with Brazil, with India, and with China remains a little bit unclear. As I prepared to land, I wanted to underscore certain things. Clearly, Africa's ambition to develop on our own terms cannot be financed by Europeans and Americans or Asians. Africa cannot go to these parts of the world, sir, and say, give us technology transfer. Right? Africa cannot go to these parts of the world and say, hey, increase the amount of ODA you give us so that we grow our human capital base so that in the next 15 years we don't need you anymore. Africa cannot go to the rest of the world and say to them, remember, Europe is experiencing energy poverty following the Russia-Ukraine war. So you want to go and say to the Europeans, hey, friends, just increase 7% of GDP or 1.7 or 3% so that we can sell our energy to you at a premium. That's why they're trying to lock us in to 30, 40, 50-year deals. Critical minerals are not just about value addition. Critical minerals are fundamentally The only way we can industrialize on our own terms and be able to create local economies in rural, peri-urban Africa that are sustainable. Critical minerals done according to the pillars of the mining vision, with backward, forward, and sideward linkages, will ensure what my colleague Deborah Mchena would say, avoiding the historical enclave economy approach to minerals development, where you develop an extraction site and a highway that goes to the port. And the areas around the extraction site remain underdeveloped. The water is polluted. The air is polluted. And in the long term, the people, the environment suffers. Critical minerals are also about our own poverty, energy poverty. Friends, we have very few. South Africa has power outages. It's Africa's most industrialized economy. Nigeria has power outages. Ethiopia, of course, has solved its power challenge. In essence, Africa continues to talk about potential. And since I haven't told you a story, a friend of mine called Priscilla Misairabwe Mshonga, who's Zimbabwe's ambassador to Sweden, told me this story. She said that every woman understands this thing called potential. I don't know if the women here agree. She says her grandmother, when she first met the grandfather, he was a young man. They were married early. They were in their teens. And he was behaving badly. So she said, oh, maybe when we're in our 20s, and since we have children, when he realizes he's a father, he'll behave better. And of course, they had 1, 2, 3, 4 children. He was still behaving badly. And she said, oh, maybe when the children grow, he will realize that, no, he can't behave their age. The children grew, and the delinquency between the father and the children was at competition level, right? And then she said, okay, maybe when the children finish university and leave home, he will realize, and the children marry and have their own children, he will realize that, look, as a grandfather, but the guy continued to behave badly. And at all the stages, the grandmother kept on saying, he has potential, from 19. And then the children grew, their grandchildren, and the grandfather was now beginning to behave badly amongst the age groups of the grandchildren. And she said, oh, maybe we are old, you know. He has the potential, actually, of being a good grandparent. He was still behaving badly. And then she said, but yes, and then she realizes at the end, she said, well, we're too old now for me to leave this potential. When I die, he will be a good companion in our old age. He was still behaving badly even in old age. And she said, anyway, he will bury me. And the idiot died before her. Friends, I didn't come to talk about potential. I came to talk about practical things. Number one, centering African agency means one thing that came out of the G20 that's important is this idea of sovereign wealth funds and rethinking the role of national, regional, and continental development banks in order to figure out ways to crowd in capital. Number two, governance and transparency. Friends, it is true that colonial systems, apartheid systems, continue to wreak havoc on us. But friends, let's be honest. The amount of splendid wastage amongst the political and social elites is unbelievable. It's a lack of consciousness of the urgency of the moment, right? It is important that as we hold the external world to account, we make sure that we don't hide our crops from the goats and hand them over to the rats. Can I repeat? Yes, sir. It is one thing to defend your maize from being destroyed by the goats, only for it to be decimated by rats once you have put it in a granary. Let's deal both with the goats and the rats in the granary. Right. The structural biases in the global system require African-led financing innovations. So the diaspora bonds and investment funds that G20 talked about, they won't come about because, you know, one of the most fantastic things, each African country has many strains, social strains, economic, and each one of them is trying to solve them individually. I just wanted to suggest that please advise them that there may be benefits in the 200 million people in Nigeria, 130 million people in Ethiopia, 50 million people in Kenya, and 50 or so million people in South Africa coming together to do something collectively. Because each of our economies, no matter how well they seem to be performing, are non-viable in the face of competition. And as crude as this sounds, Elon Musk's company alone is bigger than the collective GDPs of 51 African countries put together. And so we are vulnerable to oligarchs, but we are also vulnerable to our own stupidity. So I don't preach Pan-Africanism because I want this feel-good African thing that you were put on Afro. Of course, Claude Kabemba and I can't put on Afros because there's been soil erosion at the top of our heads. But you look, it's not just to wear African shirts. You will not survive. There is not enough economy in South Africa to create enough jobs for young South Africans. There's not enough economy in Nigeria. So the regional value chains are critical. They're not optional. And of course, unlocking fiscal power through critical minerals is key. Looking forward, because I was told now I think I have 4 minutes or so left, looking ahead and positioning, I told you which men were not in South Africa. I think I should have started by celebrating President Cyril Ramaphosa, the South African government, and South African people for one thing. When every reason existed for you to fail, you defied logic. I think this must be. There were so many young people at the G20, whether the People's Summit or the Social Summit, and vibrantly engaging. African feminists engaged. At the B20, although the American state or government was absent, American business was here in large numbers. The people-to-people relations between Americans, Europeans, Africans, and Asians remains the sole hope for achieving the things set out in that declaration. The people-to-people arrangements, company to company, labor to labor, social movement to social movement, research and academic institution to research, the new multilateralism has to be defined from ground up, and I think what you are doing today is as important as what happened in the G20. Because the feuds between states last only for a season. But the realities that lock us together because of economic and other interests are realities that can't be done away by political posturing or ideological infantile radicalism. So as we look to the US, UK, and French G20, it is important for us to remember G20 is not a policy-making site. It's an informal gathering. But what the G20 did for Africa was that for the first time, I saw African leaders sit in one room, form a trade union, an alliance, speak in solidarity, and speak with one voice. If it takes the pink man to bring us together, I really don't care. Whether you are brought back together by funeral, by wedding, or by tragedy. But what will it take to keep that collective voice and seriousness? What levels and kinds of mutual accountability are required? Of course, the issues raised were not only about Africa. What will it take for that African collective to relate to ASEAN, to BRICS, and other formations, now CARICOM? The fundamental problem in Africa is not lack of ideas. There are plenty of ideas. The fundamental problem in Africa is not lack of capacity. There is plenty capacity. The fundamental problem in Africa's development is not lack of resources. Research shows there's plenty of resources. The fundamental problem is lack of seriousness, lack of self-confidence and self-belief. We are constantly looking for supervision from our former colonizers or supervision to our new colonizers. We are like a learner driver who does not learn. The L plate has been on the African Union and our countries for too long. It's about time we graduated from learners to drivers. And fundamentally, I think the late Kempton Macamre used to say, we need courses in national and continental wisdom and cleverness. Friends, I avoided talking specifically about debt and critical minerals, and I'll tell you why, or AI. You are going to get into that nitty-gritties, but for us to know so much detail about AI, or so much detail about engineering. When I was growing up, Prof, my grandparents used to use a cow-drawn plow to plow their fields. How many of you still come from villages where we're using cow or horse-drawn plows to plow fields? We have produced hundreds of thousands of engineers who know many things, and yet we have not changed the plight of how we produce the food we eat. Our people don't live on less than $1 a day. No. Our people live on less than one brain per graduate. Not enough of our people are doing what Samora Machel said, accepting that the privilege of education must be applied for the transformation of our society. Because this decoupling of our governments and academic institutions and research capacities, this underinvestment in our societies in innovation, this over-reliance on knowledge curated elsewhere. Yes, we must get knowledge from elsewhere, get technology and skills if we can, but Africa remains at the bottom of the Global Innovation Index, not because of lack of capacity, but lack of attention and investment. So as you debate AI, critical minerals, where are you producing the graduates, the skills that will drive the Africa's beneficiation revolution? Where are you producing? And are you producing a critical mass that will drive the AI revolution in Africa? What are you investing through public finance and private finance to produce the skills? If AI competencies is still the preserve of a small elite, if critical minerals skills across is still the privilege of a small elite, Africans will do what they've always done best. Recognize the enormity of the problem. Like that friend of mine recognized the potential. And the idiot died. And she buried him. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I didn't hear the hands. Can we do it again, please? Please come to the front. This man has a clarity of mind, which is amazing, and the clarity of words, which is just amazing. I suggest that you sit so that people can see.
I'm hiding my big stomach.
All right. He's taken us from the absence of the global leaders at G20 right now to some of the issues that we're dealing with as a continent illicit financial flows that are bleeding our economies, and nothing much is being done about that. He's just taken us around the world, basically, just in the way of thinking, but landed us back safely into the continent in terms of what we need to do. And I like when you said, Africa, determine your own value. This session that we are holding today is really intended to be amplifying our voices as we determine our own value. Now, we're going to give a few minutes of time for questions and engagements with Brian here. People that maybe want to make a point or ask him a question of clarity or whatever the case may be. Make it very brief because we have to move to the next session. Is there any, okay, there's a hand over there. Okay, any other hand that I may be missing? Okay, the second hand, yeah, let's start with you, sir, and then come to you. Just say who you are and then ask your question or make your point. And then we'll take maybe 2 or 3 and then ask you to respond.
Thanks, Patrick. I'm Chris Kabwato. I'm with the Wits Center for Journalism. Brian, before you were interrupted by Arthur, you were going on to South Korea and the fallacy around it as an example. You did then reference it, but I think you kind of maybe lost your thought around it. Could you go back into it as to what is the argument that we posit around the so-called Southeast Asia tigers, and why that argument is problematic, for us in Africa as a kind of a development model for us to mimic? Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Can you give to the man in front of you?
Yeah,
Yes.
Brian, thank you so much for an excellent, really, presentation. I just want to ask, because I'm intrigued when people continue to call for the decolonization. I want to ask if what capacity we have to decolonize the system, which is so entrenched, and the coming back of ideology on a different part of the world when we are still very pragmatic. Can we decolonize, or can we simply bypass the system that keeps us down? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We're going to take, there's a hand here. We're going to take 3 at a time so that at least he can digest. Let's go to solution.
Thank you, Brian, and it's always so wonderful to listen to you. You bring too much of energy into the room.
Yeah.
You should have been at the G20. But the thing that I found interesting was the point about the Pan-African Sovereign Wealth Fund that you mentioned. Perhaps to just expand on that a little bit, noting that there are other national wealth funds, sovereign wealth funds. What would that be, how would it be constructed, and what would be the kind of impact of that wealth fund in terms of some of the comments you made? Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much. Brian, I think let's take these 3 and then we'll go to the other round. We're just going to take the second round and that will be the last due to time constraints. Okay, you want it or you want to sit? Okay.
Let me, I feel like a DJ standing behind this one. And of course, it's a liberating feeling. Chris, South Korea remains to date the largest recipient of US ODA. I think it must have received between 300 and 326 billion dollars. Let me put that in context for you. The total receipts of Africa in the last 30 years of ODA do not reach the levels that South Korea alone as a country has reached for that trajectory to industrialize. So even for people like me who are not in favor of ODA, we realize that sometimes we think there was a magic, only leadership turned this. That's why you hear us in the context of the G20 saying finance is key. Finance is key. And then if you want, because you're in an academic institution, don't believe me, go and study the structure and type of loans that South Korea was given. The intention at the time was for it to act as a buffer against the expansion of communism. There were concessional loans in the main. And so it's useful when we are giving these examples, because we give them unproblematically. Look at this country. And then we use ethics as the simple distinction between why Africa has not progressed and that other country has progressed. I'm simply challenging orthodoxy here because it's lazy intellectualism. I'm challenging this because South Korea doesn't have as many human beings or bodies as Africa. Of course, South Korea now faces a new problem. Its fertility rates are now minors. So South Korea has to figure out how to regenerate over the next 60 years without the requisite population. China has a similar problem, but it's a slow creeping in problem. And I say this because it has an implication for women in East Asia, right? So China issued, someone in the CCP issued a statement that women need to go back to the kitchen and etc. And of course there was an outrage. That in essence, there is the demographic question needs to be reflected upon in its security, economy, and broader social dimensions, perhaps much deeper, right? And so that Africa doesn't tout this, we have the youngest, the most youthful population, and et cetera, but it actually looks at how to leverage that in a meaningful way. I have suggested, maybe rather simplistically, that without dealing with how you reskill, there are many young people who graduated and actually have no skills. If you deal with this and skilling, and for those who are Zimbabweans, please, I do not wish to offend you. A lot of your maths teachers, your engineers, pharmacists came here to work in restaurants, right? Very smart waiters and etc. There's no way you can transform your country without dealing with the question of reskilling those populations. You can train, you keep training, and because the economic fundamentals are not absorbing them, yes, it looks like brain gain, right? But in fundamental sense, that means you keep it, it's almost like you keep buying a new car every year and you are renting a shack. Decolonizing the system. Systems are interesting. First, let me situate what we call colonial mindset. Those who have researched refer to the colonial matrix of power as the total occupation of social, economic, political, cultural, ecological spaces of the colonized entities, which means that the colonial matrix of power sought to determine who and how you worship, because it understood that the socio-cultural often determined the confidence of people. So if we get you to worship in ways that keep you subservient and non-questioning of power asymmetries in society, or that keeps you deferring everything that needs to be done to a spiritual space somewhere non-accessible except you die, then, well, we can really manage how you render your labor for free or affordable, and then you believe your misery is the result of divine or ancestral will. The second was in the area of knowledge, that Ngugi then wrote that Decolonizing the Mind, or Haile Selassie later translated into a Bob Marley song, Emancipate Yourself from Mental Slavery. What is this? It's the belief in the system that has been set to oppress you, that the system is right. All we have to do is to comply with it. Now, let me explain something here. A racialized capitalist system will reproduce racialized outcomes. It does not need to have a white racist male presiding over it. You can get someone like me who's silver black or metallic black presiding over that system. The logic of the system is to produce a particular outcome. A patriarchal system based on male supremacist beliefs will produce patriarchal outcomes even if you put the most competent woman in charge of it. So this idea of the system. So the global system has a coloniality of power, because what happens is that the it accumulated the surplus from the colonies as the basis for its building its reserves. And it needs constant nourishment by resources that are undervalued and labor that is undervalued. Once you revalue the labor, the natural resources, the land, you interfere with the logic of that system. That's why wars are fought to defend. That if we can extract from the DRC at the lowest potential price and avoid a situation where the Congolese become clever, educated, are able to do this, because, and then we have to tell them, you can't survive. There's something called the global trading system, the global this system. And then we actually somehow persuade them. Africa is not part of that global system. The global system sits in Europe or sits in North America, and now sits in China and elsewhere. So amongst yourself as Africans, you are of no real value. You have to treat each other with suspicion. The colonial metrics of power required divide, conquer, and control. Now I must tell you this. There were European countries that were colonized by other European countries. There were Asian countries that were colonized. The system, the logic is the same. So when people often talk about decolonization, they mix three things. They mix changing the system with creating alternatives. Africa has to do both. Change the mindset that accepts coloniality of power, but without creating alternatives, even if we decolonized, the logic of Africa as a site of extraction has spread beyond traditional colonial powers. So in essence, whilst appreciating the coloniality of global power within economic relations, the fundamental challenge is how to create alternatives based on self-reliance, based on mutuality, and etc. Now, that means, Claude, yes, you can partly decolonize, or at least pursue that as an agenda, but if that's your sole agenda, it's not transformative. And I'm not saying this to academics, sounds like an insult. It's not transformative in and of itself, because decoloniality does not create transformative futurisms. That means if future economies will be determined by critical minerals, by energy, and etc., simply making sure that colonial extraction processes are not the same or deceased does not necessarily mean you've created future economies where you are the primary actor or agent. I hope I've been able to say that. Retain the politics of decoloniality, but it's insufficient for the transformative ambition of an Africa as a driver of global growth, or an Africa exercising agency. And there is a danger, Claude, that you can, in describing historical and continuing atrocity and underdevelopment and inequity, you can enter into a moment of victimhood or purely part agency based simply on resistance. Agency needs two things: the capacity to resist and the capacity to imagine. The capacity to resist must be maintained, because some Africans say, oh, forget decolonization, forget this, because it's long gone. No, its continuing effects are still there. But so if you just focus on history, you also tell a lie. The lie is based on erasure. So part of the colonial enterprise was to create the impression that there was no knowledge, no innovation, that African identity is only defined by the tragic moment of chattel enslavement and colonization, so that the Africa can only imagine their being and their place in the world through the lens of the atrocities, those true atrocities. I guess what I'm saying to you is no. Pan-Africanism is about also imagining our agency and our place, not purely based on the historical events of the last 300 years or 600 years, but based on the fact that we had a great history before, we had a great history even in the moment of atrocity, and we have even greater futures that are based on our ability to walk on those 2 feet, the resistance feet and the creative imaginative feet. Yeah. And lastly, the issue, right, lastly, this issue on the sovereign wealth fund. So basically, my own sense is there are 34 national sovereign wealth funds. And the 34 give us these lessons. There are lies that we had believed amongst ourselves that the country needs to have surplus to set up a sovereign wealth fund. So clearly, we now know from the 34, only 2 countries actually had surplus, right? But the performance of those funds has given us an insight into something. That the fundamental capacity to crowd in local capital, to crowd in capital into local economies, will not come from FDI or ODA, because 70% of ODA is targeting social bit or infrastructure. And those of you who do investments, the returns on infrastructure, especially macro infrastructure, are very slow. And the rate at which you have to repay, right, essentially makes infrastructure investment in the short term a lot more expensive. In part, we have not figured out, as I said in the beginning, how do we get the beneficiaries, the big companies of that infrastructure, to contribute to its sustenance and maintenance, right? So, but if you want to crowd in the SMEs, crowd in, you have to de-risk. You can't de-risk using, because private capital is worried about risk. So you need some forms of public capital, which means the pivot in the NDBs, and the capacity to create. Why do I think a Pan-African sovereign wealth fund is a better solution? I think that economies of scale matter. The 34 national sovereign wealth funds can invest in the Pan-African one, right? And that would essentially means you ratchet up what you have. And with the leverage they will get from Africa Development Bank, Afro-Exim Bank, and elsewhere, it simply means the capital we have available for development, especially of local economy and the middle economy, is much bigger. We create a much, the problem we've had is that we're creating wealth, but we're not creating jobs. So I was being educated by, I think it is Depros, that we had jobless growth, chaotic growth, and unrooted growth. So the problem we're addressing is stabilization of the economy, but also addressing this idea that the growth is jobless, but it's also unrooted. So you have nice big GDP figures, 7%. It's not rooted in local economies. So you almost have this binary, this dichotomy between the economy described in the national statistics and the economy of the people. And stabilization funds enable us to then also be futuristic. I think the biggest problem, like I said, is we are not able to plan beyond the 5 years of any government, right? And the governments themselves don't reason about our economies beyond 5 years. If we want intergenerational investment into skills, into micro and macro infrastructure, into energy, into technology, there's simply not enough from the tax, from the revenue base, from the tax base, to be able to place in this. And if we do it country by country, the regional institutions, and I'll end with this, we've been talking about INGADEB now for almost 20 years, right? You remember this, right? The reason why we haven't invested in INGADEM is we're waiting for Europe to give us money for INGADEM. INGADEM will solve the energy crisis in South Africa, energy crisis in Zimbabwe, in Zambia, and etc. And the longer we talk about it without investing in it, essentially means it doesn't happen, and the energy crisis in our countries continues. What is energy crisis? It's not just households not having lighting. It simply means the small to medium enterprise is not able to produce at a sustainable cost to become regionally and globally competitive. So in essence, we need to create a vehicle of alternative financing that's domestic in the sense of being regionalized and nationalized, that can benefit individual country actors, like individual country members. But we realized that it's a coalition of the willing. Not every country will want to come into a Pan-African sovereign wealth fund. But number 3, you have to make sure that it is clear governance systems, it is accountable, it is system. I hope I've been able to answer at least one question.
You've answered all of them. Thank you. Unfortunately, for those people that had their hands up, we're not going to take them just yet because of time. Please bear with me on that one. Just to say that on the sovereign wealth funds issue, there is a study that has been done by DBSA, along with another, I think a university. It's a great study which really gets into this issue. So those who are interested in that, please try and get hold of that study.